Hi, everyone. This is Functional Training Zone with our podcast, The Uncommon Connector. Today, we have a very, very special guest that I'm super excited to interview. It's Miss Diana Monaco. She was actually my eighth grade science teacher. So this is such a full circle moment. I'm super excited to interview her. Um, and we're just going to get started.
There is no one else in creation like you. There's nobody like you. And what you've come to do and what you have to offer is like no other.
And we're just gonna get started. Miss Monaco, how are you?
Alright.
Yes, I have to call you Miss Monaco because that's how I remember you.
Hey, Diana, which is fine, but how are you? This is full circle for me too, by the way.
Great, great. So we are going to go ahead, dive in, and get started. I know all about you. I probably don't know everything, but in my mind, I feel like, we grew up together, so to speak, right? You were growing in your career, and I was growing in education. So when I first met you, I had to be maybe 11 or 12 years old. You were my seventh grade science teacher first, right?
Yep,
Okay,
yep.
and then the next year, because you were the first year when I was in seventh grade.
Yep.
All right, so can you tell us a little bit about how you became a teacher in Brooklyn, New York, in like the early 90s, because that was such a revolutionary time in education, for women in education, for women in science altogether. I think that we don't realize how the 90s really, really cultivated women in the workforce just altogether to bring us to where we are today. So could you just tell us your story? I'm in listening mode.
All right, great. So we're gonna have to start pre-90s. I basically always described myself as the accidental teacher. It was not on my radar to be a teacher. I went to St. Joseph's College, which is now St. Joseph's University in Fort Greene in Brooklyn. Um, and I went there also without applying to that school, believe it or not. I had a guidance counselor in high school who saw that I had an aptitude in science. She applied. And next thing I know, I'm at St. Joseph's College as a freshman with the full scholarship as a chemistry major, of all things. And really, no planning, no prepping, which is so bizarre when I think about it now. And I did have an aptitude for it, and I had a love for it, but I had no idea what I was doing with it. So I wound up after graduating college in the pharmacy industry. I went to Long Island University School of Pharmacy. I did not graduate. I actually left because I realized it's not what I wanted to do. But I worked as a farm tech in the pharmaceutical industry for a while before I said, I need to try something else. I had a teacher, my older sister, who was a teacher at that time. I think she taught Spanish and language arts, if I'm not mistaken. And she kind of like said, well, why don't you try teaching? And I said, all right. So I pulled out the yellow pages. Nobody knows what they are probably now. This was pre-internet. And we would get these big books called the Yellow Pages, and it was all the businesses in the area in Brooklyn, New York. And I started just looking at schools. So I knew I wasn't going to get hired by a public school in New York because I hadn't gone to school to be a teacher, but I knew I had a chance at a private or parochial Catholic school. And St. Angela Hall Academy was on my radar. I called, and the secretary said that they weren't hiring because I had no experience. But you know what? I showed up anyway with the resume. I just showed up. The next day, I rang the doorbell. They let me in. I met with what was her name? Sister Catherine Allison. I don't know if you remember her, right?
She
She's
actually came to my wedding.
yes, she was tough, but she was also real. If you were on her good side, And I
Yeah.
talked to her a little bit and we kind of hit it off. And I wound up interviewing, and they said, "All right, you really want this job." Unbeknownst to me, the science teacher was retiring that year or relocating. I don't remember.
I think
Um,
she was relocating because Miss Khan was my science teacher at PS 270 down the street. I went to public school before I transferred to St. Angela Hall, and she was actually my teacher there. And I remember her. So I think she relocated.
that's a small world. I didn't realize that. Well,
It is a small world.
she handed me a textbook and said, "Well, come tomorrow and you'll teach a class." So I didn't know that I should have been panicking at that time. Like it didn't occur to me that I shouldn't be this confident because I had never taught a day in my life. I came home and I invented a lesson in earth science about soil. Went in the next day, taught it. That's really the very short version of the story. And I taught there for, I believe it was 6 years at St. Angela Hall. I taught there for
Wow.
6 years and I taught science and I loved it. And I think what I loved about it, now that I can reflect back, I love that there was a lot of autonomy for me as a teacher to teach the kids that were in front of me. And there wasn't this pressure of what the outside world was saying the science should look like, because I've always been and always will be a scientist first, always. That's just how my brain works. That's how I operate, even in the kitchen, believe it or not, when I'm cooking. I have that knack for it. And to be able to stand in front of a group of kids and teach in that way was pretty amazing. And to have a school that allowed me to do it was very progressive for that time, by the way.
I do often think back to St. Angela Hall Academy and think about how progressive it was for for the time.
Yep.
Um, I remember like our rap groups, how progressive that was.
Yes.
I will say this, the first time I looked at a New York Times newspaper was in your class. I remember somehow you got us a free subscription
Yes. Hmm.
and we would get the newspaper. And I think it was like for homeroom, we had to like read it or shuffle through it or look at a news article. And I remember that to this day because that turned me into a newspaper reader.
Yay. That makes
Yes.
me
And
so happy.
yeah, and like I remember looking at the pages with the stocks on there. I don't even know if they still do it, but it would say like what the price was when the market opened and you were like it's the day that it closed, the day before, and I would look on there and I remember that and I was like, I I tell my mom how progressive St. Angela Hall was for that time. They really gave the teachers that taught there room to grow in the classroom as teachers. Um, you probably weren't there, but there was a teacher named Miss Lee in third grade, and she was from Chinese descendant, all of us were first generation, right? So like my parents came from someplace else, your parents came, New York City is just a melting pot. But she had chopsticks on her desk. And when we would forget our fork, she would give us chopsticks. And to this day, like I am so good with chopsticks because I have muscle memory from a kid. I love that school so much. I wish I could resurrect it and send my children there today because it was just such a great place to learn.
And it
But
was.
getting back, go ahead.
It was because we weren't restricted. It's one of those things, like we didn't, people say, well, almost sometimes I think, well, we didn't know any better. We didn't know any differently. We were a group of people that trusted one another, and you were the expert in whatever it was. So the art teacher was really an artist. The
Yeah,
math
she
teacher
was.
was really a mathematician. Like everybody was really who they said they were. I was really a scientist, and there was a built-in trust. And it was really, when they talk about child-centered, to me, St. Angela Hall Academy was the most child-centered school I had ever worked in, ever. I have such a fondness and such a soft spot for that. And it modeled a lot of how I moved into the other schools I was with, a lot of why I went into social work. not as a career, but I became a licensed master social worker. It dictated a lot of that for me because I saw the value in that whole child-centered, child-first type of mentality that St. Angela Hall really embodied.
Right. I love my time learning there. So I wanted to thank you for that because, you know, I was really good in chemistry one and two in high school, and I would have to credit that to you. I took chemistry in college, well, chemistry for non-science majors because I was an accounting major, but I don't think I would have had a love for science the way I did if it wasn't for your teaching style, your personality, and what you brought to the classroom. So I wanted to thank you for that.
That makes me feel so good.
So now you said that you studied pharmacy first. You kind of went through where you went to school. Um, if there was someone that's listening to this that really, really wanted to become a pharmacist, what advice would you give them? What do you think? How would they go about doing that? I know now that pharmacy has definitely changed quite a bit. I think it might even be an MD.
Uh,
Um,
yeah, it's a doctoral. Yep. Um, I,
so
I mean, I would say if you really want to do it, obviously, right? If you really want to do something, do something. Um, how you would go about it, I think that for me, and this goes for any career that anybody wants to go into, definitely do your research, definitely use resources like what you're doing here at Functional Training Zone to be able to talk to people that are in those careers because there's a lot of beauty in any career and in anything that you do want to do, whether it be pharmacy, whatever it is. But then there's the reality. So it might not be that you can't be a pharmacist. It might be that you want to work in the pharmacy industry, but perhaps not as a pharmacist. So I think it's really important to kind of try to get as much connection as you can to somebody in those fields. Work at a pharmacy if you can. That's how
right.
I realized I might want to be a pharmacist. I worked as a cashier in a pharmacy here and that still exists in Gowanus, Brooklyn. Um, and I really liked the idea of being in a science helping field that was kind of non-medical. I knew I didn't want to be a medical doctor. I knew I could never deal with that intensity and that pressure. I knew I didn't want to be a nurse because I had people in my life that were nurses and I knew I couldn't deal with that intensity and pressure. Um, so pharmacy really spoke to me. It didn't wind up being what I did, but I honestly look back at that and I don't feel like it was a waste of my time either, because I did use those skills and what I learned in that field a lot as a teacher. But for me, I would say it really comes down to, and schools, you really have to understand what schools are asking for in order to offer you this degree. It's a very intensive program. It's also very expensive, you know. So there's a lot more I think that kids or young adults have to think about that I don't think I ever thought about, but there are also a lot more resources. So really, resources are a big one.
Here at Functional Training Zone, we do talk a lot about how much a degree costs. I started out at Pace for my undergrad, and then I finished at Fairleigh Dickinson in Madison, New Jersey. And when I graduated, I had close to 300,000 in debt because I went to a private school.
That hurts.
I will have to say I got lucky though. My husband did not go to college, so he helped me pay it off. We kind of paid it off together and we were successful in that way. But, you know, it it's hard and education is expensive. And so what we really try to do with all of our podcasts is let folks know the pros and the cons, right? Like, yeah, school is hard. Careers are worth it. You will have to pay for it, but there are resources.
Yes.
So we definitely like to drive that home. When you transferred over to teaching,
Mhm.
what was it like teaching in the early 90s? And how is it different from today? I mean, so much has happened in that I'm gonna say what? Oh my God, I don't know how many years that is, but 20,
A lot.
30
It's
years, a
a
lot.
lot of
I know. I
years.
know. Because we'll be aging both of us because you taught
Exactly.
me.
So
But
stop.
so much has happened in that time, right? We have social media, we have the internet. There's now access to, knowledge at, the touch, you're right at your hand. There's AI. There's so many different facets to education now that the field is so revolutionary. But how has it changed from then to now? And you've grown in the field.
Yeah, I have to say that okay, great things like the pros and the cons, right? Really good things. So the pros, like access to information, I think is um not a bad thing. So valuable information is never bad. I'm an information person by nature, and I love information. I'm kind of like almost like a research junkie in that way. Um, Being able to access information and look at things in a different way or look at different perspectives is always great. The cons with that is what kind of information are you getting? So as a teacher before the internet, you kind of stood in front of those kids and you were it. Like it was you. It was you and whatever the textbook was. You referenced the New York Times because I had, brought the subscription into the school. It was you and whatever resources you brought in to the classroom. It was the kids going home and hopefully, having a conversation about what it was that had been talked about. And then you were getting the opinions of the people in your house that you might have been having that talk with. It wasn't anybody going online and verifying information and, pulling out maybe information that wasn't so factual. So there's a lot of pressure, I think, on teachers back then to make sure that you got the information out that needed to be gotten out because there's curriculum. So seventh grade, you need to know this, and eighth grade, you need to know that. So you would depend on whatever state, city guidelines you had, plus working in a school like St. Angela Hall that was pretty progressive, able to kind of like put my doorbell just rang, but I think it's okay. Put whatever information. So there was a lot more pressure in that time for teachers. Um, I don't want to say to get the information right, but to really present as much information and present it in ways that were interesting, which was also not easy at times to do. It was hard as a teacher to look at and see these like blank faces because it was like, okay, this is boring, which happens. It's, normal. I don't know if you remember at St. Angela Hall, and this might have been after you graduated, we got the internet.
It was after I graduated, yeah.
It was like close, I think, more 95, if I remember the year. And I remember getting a classroom computer and the idea that a student can go and ask a question and get limited research, but get something. That was like that was when I started to see like the classroom walls almost like kind of disappeared. But then with that is this extra layer of responsibility for the adult that's in the room, for the teacher, making sure that they know how to utilize that tool because it's an extremely powerful tool. The downside of that is when you start to talk about social media, because now communication never ends. And the day for kids, in a lot of ways, never ends, especially with the advent of cell phones, text messaging, social media. Um, so then, as a teacher, you're also dealing with that. You're actually competing with that in a lot of ways. And you're kind of vying for that student's attention in certain ways, even if you're controlling the use of whatever that tool is. So like classroom laptops, right? We used to have them all the time, and the kids were allowed to use them for a certain amount of time during the class to do research. There's a limited amount of control you have if the student's off Googling something else or on a different website,
Website. Right.
getting distracted. So it's the good and the bad.
You know, I struggle with social media now as a parent, because my son loves video games. He's 10. My daughter wants to do every TikTok dance challenge, what it is. My husband and I stood firm on not giving our children devices when they were younger. And then the pandemic came, right? And the school gave them devices.
Yep.
They didn't know how to get on YouTube. We literally had to teach them. They picked it up very quickly, obviously, but the school was the first facilitator
Oh,
of smart devices in our household. Before that, all they knew was our cell phones, my cell phone and my husband's
mhm.
cell phone. Once the pandemic came and they got these tablets that were issued by the school, oh my, it was uncontrollable. It was like a wildfire. I mean, they were supposed to be on virtual school, but they would wander onto another site. I mean, we never even taught them this. It's like they just knew exactly how to do it without being taught. And now that they're older, we struggle with it because, my hard and fast rule is during the week, when you go to school, you come home. Unfortunately, homework is now limited, right? So there isn't all of this homework that you guys, not that you guys inundated us with homework, but we had math, we had social studies, we had science, we had Spanish, we had subjects, and we came home and we did homework and we would sit around the kitchen table and do it for 2 or 3 hours. That doesn't exist anymore. So my kids don't get any homework. If they do anything extra after school, I have to give it to them. And they're not allowed to have their devices, and they say I'm a mean mom. What is your perspective on that? Please tell me I'm not a mean mom.
You're
That
not.
you,
You're not. You're not a mean mom at all. So my kids are 24 and 27, and my kids were actually coming up in middle school when devices were starting to become much more popular, right? And it, I'm happy that my kids were a little bit older when devices were starting to become more popular, and I'm happy that parents are opting to kind of hold that back from their kids today as much as they possibly can. I think it's incredibly brave of you because it's got to be a hard, hard battle.
yeah.
I want to just touch on the homework thing a little bit. I think that it's hard for parents at home and for guardians and anyone who is involved with the child when they come home from school when there's really nothing specific for that child to do. This whole, I don't want to call it a movement because I don't want anybody to get upset with me, but this whole idea that we shouldn't be sending home homework has always boggled my mind personally because I feel that there's some value to it. I think that we kind of went from too much to nothing, and the middle was there was so much we could have done with the middle. The middle could have been, having the kid go home and work on something that they really like, or producing, if they liked creative art, writing, or if they were an artist, or they like to do like tiny little experiments at home, or they love to do research, and you have kids that love math. I feel like we lost this opportunity, this little pocket there for schools to kind of help guide families towards whatever their kids' interest is and to help continue to develop skills that children need. So that whole homework thing is a little bit of a sore spot for me personally, because I feel like we lost a little bit of an opportunity there.
So homework is definitely a sore spot for me. As a parent, I'll get these calls from the school that maybe my son's reading isn't where it's supposed to be.
Hmm.
But I don't know what his reading is supposed to be because nothing is sent home. So
Exactly.
I'm reading with him, and I think he's reading great because we could possibly be reading below the reading level that he needs to be reading at. So that's a constant struggle that I have, between the work that the kids should be doing and the work that I give them to do. I am an advocate for homework or something after school. Um, the kids are on chapter books now. They both read chapter, I make them read a chapter out of their chapter book whatever book that they want to pick, and then they have to do some kind of math, and then their chores. And obviously, they do play sports. So both my son and my daughter play sports after school. I do rush them off to those activities. But as an educator, I would have to assume that it's difficult with there not being any homework because how do you really reinforce what you've taught during the day, to make sure that they're getting it in
Great
the evening?
question. That's a great question. I mean, the last 20 years, I was in a private school that was identified as progressive. I don't know if it was as progressive at maybe as they thought they were. And the homework thing for me was always a sore kind of like button issue because I always felt like we're missing this opportunity. So now I'm not assigning homework because I'm being told that we're not assigning homework. So it does two things to the teacher. A, it creates this situation where you have to constantly be reviewing information, but not really knowing 100% what kids are getting stuff and not getting it as quickly as you would if you assigned some homework and you had the opportunity to say, hey, let's talk about this question that I assigned in science. I don't know, whatever it is. Like, do you believe greenhouse emissions are real? Whatever, pick anything. And being able to have that conversation with the students, and you can kind of quickly pick out based on the responses, whether they're written or verbal, what the kids get out of this topic. Are they using the key terms? Are they applying the key terms properly? Are they using advanced terms, right? But the other thing it does is it kind of slows down the rate of teaching in the classroom. Because if
Right.
I'm not assigning something and giving you the responsibility to, you're kind of taking a little bit of the ownership of the education away from the kids. And then you brought up a really, really good point that a lot of parents bring up is how do I really know what my child's supposed to be doing or where this should be at? This goes with any subject. It could be math, it could be reading, it could be writing, it could be science. It doesn't matter.
Mm. I struggle with that constantly. So hearing that from you gives me comfort that at least I'm not alone. Thank you for that. And it takes away responsibility from this younger generation where letting them have ownership and responsibility for something.
Right.
Another core memory that I have that I hold dear to my heart is our science fairs. I remember I was struggling with a science fair project one year, and I went to you, and you gave me to the science project to do "Is your pen a lemon?" And I had to test different pens under, different circumstances. So I said to my kids, do you guys have anything like this? Do you have a science fair where you guys are doing experiments or anything? No. And I'm like, okay.
That breaks my heart. Um, and you know that St. Angela Hall Science Fair, I don't know if you remember this, but I used to work with St. Joseph's College. Just so happened that's where I graduated from. My mentor was still there, Dr. Mary Meyer, and she would come with the college students to kind of loosely judge the science fairs, to be honest with you. And the whole point of something like that, and it goes for any area of study, I don't care what subject area it is the trial and error. Make the mistakes and figure it out. And if you don't
Mm,
have the opportunity to do that, where are you doing it?
right.
Where are you doing it? That's the concern that I have. That's the opportunity that I feel is missed with the whole homework debate. And I know that there's a very good argument for the idea that we're giving too much homework. Absolutely. But to go from too much to practically nothing, I really feel we missed something. We took away, from the young Allisons, their opportunity to look at something as silly as is your pen a lemon? Like, really? Like, what did you do with that? Topic wise, just the question. You didn't do anything with that in the grand scheme of your life. However, the skills that you used to figure that out, you did develop through that process and you did improve on. do that
Right.
process.
I did another science fair project having to do with fish. And I remember I bought a fish tank and I separated it, and it was, does the space that you give a fish determine how much it would grow? Well,
Mhm.
from that science project, I became quite fascinated with fish. And now all over our house, we have fish tanks from that science project.
Awesome.
Yes.
That's impressive.
So, I mean, I think that just these learning these things and like you said, trial and error as a kid really, really does lend to, what you'll be interested as an adult and things that you'll have as an adult and the way that you grow just in your interests, right? Not in any way that I'm a marine biologist. However, it did help me with my love for aquariums and fish tanks. And we have fish tanks all over our house because of this science project that I did in seventh grade. And I love that. So we talked a little bit about the pandemic. How did the pandemic change teaching um, during that? I'm going to call it a 3 year span, only because my kids were in school. They were home for 1 year. They were virtual for half a year, and then they were in school with masks for half a year.
Practically virtual, truthfully, because of the space confinements and all the restrictions that we had. Uh, that was hard. And I'm going to speak just for myself as a science teacher, because by the time I realized that I really was a science teacher and that I loved to do it, my whole perspective was hands-on and learning through experience and giving the students the opportunity to figure things out, right? And I'm in this school and I had gotten this physical lab together that the school, said, great, this is what we're going to do. And you have equipment and all this stuff. And then the pandemic hits. And what are we doing? How are you keeping kids piqued and interested? So there I am, like, I think like maniacally at one point, like really stressed out as a teacher, trying to figure out what websites and what resources. And, I'm literally like we are now. We're on a Zoom call. I'm a person in a box and you're a person in a box. How do I keep the science interesting? So I started to do things like kitchen science, things that they would have at home. And you know, simple as like acids and bases, like what do you have in the house? And when you make pancakes, how does the pancake become fluffy? And, trying to pull in whatever I could. Look, it still wasn't enough, to be honest with you. It still wasn't enough. And I'm not ever going to think that it was. Then we go back and we're in the classroom, but you're restricted, right? You're not allowed. The kids are sitting basically in these plexiglass enclosures practically, right? It was a little bit better, but you could start to feel like I could almost start to feel like the kids were shrinking because you had these kids behind masks, no physical contact. It was confining. I almost felt, to be honest with you, that going back in person and being under those restrictions was more confining than if they were home on Zoom. That's how I experienced it. And that's how a lot of kids would talk about it. And we started to see a lot of change in mood and temperament, not just of the students. I mean, mostly the students because they're kids, but also the adults.
Mhm. How do you think that the pandemic, I mean, obviously we all had a check on our mental awareness. I mean, everybody handled it differently, right? Some of us lost loved ones, some of us kind of watched it from afar because we were social distancing and, we were by ourselves. A lot of us experienced it through our children because there were a time when I wasn't allowed back to work, but I'm going to send my child to school. Like how do
Okay.
you
What does that mean? How
right,
does that
how do
make
they right. So it's safe for my kid to go back to school, but it's not safe for me to go into the office. So it was hard for me to rationalize a lot in my head. I felt like for sometimes we were just puppets doing what we were told to do
Mhm.
because we didn't know what to do. But how do you think that that affected everyone's mental awareness of just a sense of normalcy and regaining a sense of normalcy?
I do think it brought out, yes, it brought out the best in a lot of people in terms of we had this common thing we were working to overcome. But in that, I feel that especially for kids, the mental health impact was huge. I think that it might have set uh, a lot of certain populations and maybe underserved children
Communities.
back because, you know, these are kids that depended on physically being able to go to school in a lot of ways. We, I think, did not realize the value of physically having a place to go and physically being able to communicate with whether it's another student, one of your peers, or a teacher. You know, that whole component, having that taken away for so long, I really do think had a negative impact. And what I did notice with a lot of students that were like top kids in science, say in the sixth grade, right? So now in the seventh grade, we're virtual, right? Eighth grade, we're coming back. Very subdued, very hard to get them to rise and rally in class. Even things that used to get them motivated, not so much. Almost like a sedative almost state with certain kids, which was a little bit hard to combat. Did we work on that? Of course we work on it because you never want to see anybody shut down. But that mental health aspect, at least from my perspective, and I have to preface this by saying New York City was, I think, an alternate universe compared to other parts of the country. I had family in Florida that had no idea what I was even talking about. I had family in New Jersey that were like, "What? What are you talking about?" You know, we're in communities in Brooklyn where we're driving by funeral homes and hospitals and there's freezer trucks outside. We know what that means, right? We're walking around in these neighborhoods that are desolate. Nobody's coming outside except at a certain time at night to bang pots and pans in honor of, you know, the healthcare workers. So New York City was this really bizarre space. Then we go back to school, and it almost felt more bizarre because you're in these really restrictive pods in a school building.
Mhm.
So the mental health impact was huge for our kids, huge. And of course, for the adults,
Right,
was
definitely.
huge.
New York City is different altogether, the way that they handle anything in
Yes.
general. So I can't imagine being a resident of New York during the pandemic. My I had family that was still there. I would keep in contact with them. I lived in a different state, so yes, we did face different different obstacles, but they were just different in retrospect because obviously it wasn't just such an overpopulated area,
Right.
right? Right.
That
Just
had a
in terms of volume, in terms of numbers, sheer volume, we didn't just have the population that, New York City has. Um, Back to teaching.
lot.
What are some skills do you think are vital in this career field in being a teacher that have carried you through the years?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I didn't even realize until I started to have student teachers with me, and every year I'd have one or two, um, was realizing this idea that if you're afraid of having your feelings hurt, don't go into teaching. Do not, especially do not go into teaching kids because they can be brutal. So my whole thing, what I would say to the student teachers, leave the ego at the door. Be prepared to be wrong, be prepared to be corrected, and be okay with it. And your job is to figure out to kind of how to finesse apologizing if you have to kids. And if you kids love to correct their teachers, by the way, it's a pretty big deal for them. Being able to accept that and the personalities that sit in front of you. So it's a lot of juggling. I think that you have to have a lot of energy. You have to be very forgiving to yourself, but also to these people that you have sitting in front of you that aren't always having their best day either. So to me, my biggest piece of advice is you have got to leave your ego at the door when you're a teacher. You just have to.
I remember being in seventh and eighth grade and being so hormonal. I mean, I don't even know how you taught that age group because, like, I felt like we were so, especially me, maybe I was quiet, but in my head, I was all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah, of course you were. And by the way, I love middle school. I love that age and I love the K. And maybe it's because I have ADHD. I don't really know. I loved that age. I loved that. I loved the the just the excitement of the kids. And even when things weren't going great, like that was okay too, right? So you have to just as a teacher, and I'm talking about of kids, and whether it's lower school, middle school, high school is very challenging, right? Once you get into college and stuff, people are a little bit more settled, n- are studying stuff they want to. It's a different interest level. You really just have to know that you have got to leave your ego at the door and you have to be all in. You got to be all in.
Right.
You have to be all in.
What would you say is your biggest success factor?
As a teacher,
Yeah, an educator.
persistence, persistence and humility, which goes hand in hand with the ego thing. And I didn't know I was able to do that. That was just a skill I developed because of the parents that I had. It was either you figured stuff out or you were out of luck, kind of. That's how I was
Right,
raised. But
right,
persistence, persistently wanting to impress the kids, persistently wanting to impress them to do better for themselves, not to impress them because I wanted them to like me, but to impress them that they could do this, to walk away knowing that even if students would come and tell me they couldn't do this because science was hard, for me to really be able to say and mean and mean to them, like say this with meaning. It's not that science is difficult. You just haven't, thought of it the right way, or you didn't look at it a certain way. Like I loved the problem solving aspect of it, the persistence. I think
right.
it was having persistence.
What would you say is one of the hardest things you had to do as an educator, as a teacher, as a mentor?
Yeah.
Because I do believe that our teachers are our mentors.
Yes,
Um,
I agree.
so, you know, I'm still in contact with you. So I consider this a mentoring moment. I reached out to you to, help us with the podcast and to lend your experience. What would you say is one of the most difficult things in teaching?
I honestly think it's the administration. I think it's the bobbing and the weaving of how things change. Um, I think it's coming in to meetings and being told that you have to implement something a certain way that you don't 100% agree with or aren't on board with, and having to fight to do things your way. It's seems a lot more restrictive now. I mean, I'm out of it for 3 years now, but I'm still in contact with people who are still teaching this whole idea that we're testing constantly,
Right,
and teachers and the old thing teaching to test is true. It
right,
exists, that whole the metrics. I think that's all very difficult on
right.
teachers because it puts sometimes a level of expectation on the teacher that is kind of feels like you can't get past it in a lot of ways, and then that passes on to the students and to how the students are being taught. Like for example, in New York, I don't understand why we still have regents exams. I
In high
just don't.
school. So, right. So I didn't go to high school in New York. I went to high school in Jersey. But my mom talks about the Regents exams that she had to take
Mhm.
in high school all the time. And she said they were so hard.
They were very difficult, and the pass was, I think it was, you had to get a 65 to pass. And I have clear memory of being taught to pass this test, but I don't have any clear memory of the topics. Like I don't have any, like you talk about the fish tank experiment, and like you have memories of things that you learned for the sake of learning it, right?
Mhm.
I have memories of being taught to pass a test, and I'm talking about I graduated high school in 1986. I left teaching 3 years ago. That was still happening. So things like that to me, are hard. That made the teaching part hard because why are we still doing this?
Yeah,
I don't know. Why are we still doing it?
I don't know either.
It's a big
I
question.
yeah, I don't know. That is a good question. Where do you see teaching going in the future? You know, there's a big AI push now, right? There's ChatGPT, there's AI. I mean, I remember being a kid and having my grandparents invested in encyclopedias. We had these huge encyclopedias in our house. They were the holy grail of knowledge, you know. Now, a lot of, you know, even my daughter is like, oh, I can just go to AI and it types it for me and it, you know, all my college papers, you know, there was this big plagiarism thing. If I plagiarized anything, I would be hung by my toenails, you know. But now it seems like that's the way to go. So where do you see the future of education going with all of these new, I don't even know what to call them, right? Revolutionary ways of,
I would like to think that they're tools, but then I don't know if that's really true. I don't know if they are tools. I think that we're going to lose a fair amount of creativity. And I'm worried about that. I don't know if I'm right. I could never say that I'm right because I'm not in that arena. I do see how it's changed, even for myself. I'm typing something on a Google Doc, and all of a sudden, this little thing comes up in the lower right-hand corner if I want it to be read, and corrected, and which is all very tempting and lovely. But I feel like there's a certain amount of freedom of expression and creativity that's going to be lost. And then this whole idea of, when you took tests and wrote your papers and things like that, that was you. And that was you learning from your mistakes. And that was you sitting down with an adult, a teacher, a mentor, whomever it was, a parent, an older brother, sister, whoever was helping you, sitting down and looking at this. And it's not just the learning opportunity, there's also a big social component to that, to being able to do that with another human being. And there's another mental health component that's embedded in there to enable to do that to another human being. And I just mentioned to you persistence. There's that persistence of working on it yourself and walking away with something that you persisted in, that you produced. Does
right.
Chat GPT and AI take that away from us? I think it's a big question.
There is a sense of pride. I mean, I was never in any way an author, but there is a sense of pride knowing that you've written something, you've produced it, and it is your work.
Yeah,
You know, you did the research behind it, you looked it up yourself, and you learned other things while
exactly.
researching this topic because inevitably you will stumble upon other things that from researching one thing or another that'll take you down a road. So, you know, you are right. It is very tempting to hit AI, and I have. I'm not going to say I haven't. However, there is definitely a certain pride that you have when it's something that you've produced on your very own. Um, if anybody wants, okay, what advice would you give somebody, you know, looking to or inquiring about becoming an educator, going into the field of education, becoming a teacher? What advice would you give them? I think we went over that you get before. You said you would stay consistent, but in this day and age, what else would they have to do to make this career long term?
Right. I mean, to me, it doesn't matter what stage of your life you're in. If you're somebody who's never really worked with kids and you think you want to be a teacher because somebody said, "Oh, you'd be a great teacher," and chances are, figure out a way to work with kids, volunteer somewhere and work with kids. Work with the population of kids that you think you want to work with, whatever the age group is, high school, whatever it is. See if there are opportunities to actually connect with that population because it might be that you don't want to be a classroom teacher for that age group. Maybe you're really great with younger kids, maybe you're great with older kids. I think knowing that going in is a big, big deal because you're not teaching to empty seats. You're going in there with a whole population of whomever it is that you decide to teach, and that will impact how you are as a teacher. So to me, I fell into middle school, and it just so happened I loved that age. But what if I hadn't? I
Right.
would have never known that because I never was exposed to any type of teaching prior to that. So I would say, first and foremost, try to volunteer with the age group that you think you want to teach.
Right. What advice would you give yourself, your younger self, back 20, 30 years ago? What advice would you give yourself back then, knowing what you know now?
I mean, I'm a Gen Xer. Everybody knows what that means. We're all over TikTok, apparently. My life was pretty linear. So you did this, you did this, you did this, you did this. I would tell myself it's not linear. It's not linear. It doesn't have to be such a straight line. You can mix it up a little bit. It wouldn't have been the end of the world if I hadn't gone to college right out of high school, or if I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do when I was in college. The world wouldn't have imploded. I didn't have to graduate college and then go on to try to be in another career. It did not have to be so linear that I could have explored a lot more.
Thank you for saying that. That speaks to my heart. I was raised in a very traditional household, you know. Um, my mom and I lived with my grandparents, and there were certain expectations that they had of me. And you're right. The career the life that they wanted for me was very linear, right? It was time to go to college. It was time to find my career. It was time to get married. It was time to have kids. And when it didn't fall into that row, I could remember the look on my grandparents' face, like, almost like, what? You you're not? And why? And we've
Yeah,
invested so much into you. And there was a level of expectation for me to do these things at this time. And if I had chance to grow, if I had a chance to explore, if I had a chance to be more of myself, where would I be? Would I be more of a creative personality? I think I am a creative personality, but it was time to go to college.
right. And I have to tell you, it's one of the things that I appreciate about millennials and Gen Z, which I know they get a bad rap in a lot of ways. But one of the things I have to say that we can learn from them is that they are not as linear as we were.
Right.
And there's something to be said for that. So things like what you're doing with this podcast and the functional training zone, and them being able to know, like, maybe they're on the right track too. Having resources for them to help figure out this non-linear life that they might be creating for themselves is exciting. So I would definitely, and I benefit from millennials and Gen Z. I mean, I'm a listener. I listen and I have them in my family, and close to my family. And I appreciate that so much about themselves that they're like, wait, what do you mean? Like, I can't take a gap year? Like, so I take a gap year and I'm going to go work or volunteer wherever. And I think to myself, wow, it never even occurred to me that that was an option. Like, how awesome is that that's an option?
Right. I was having a conversation with my mom yesterday, and I don't know if I upset her or not, but I did say to her, because you struggled, I don't have to struggle.
Hmm.
Like, I don't have to struggle. And I'm going to choose ease every time if I can. And she looked at me and
Right.
she goes, that's true. And she agreed with me. And I was happy for that. We had a moment.
Yep, and
So
that's true
everything,
mom sentiment. I'm a mom, and I agree with that. That's a true sentiment. You want your kids to feel so confident that they don't feel like they have to struggle the way you did.
thank you for that. And what are you doing now? If our listeners wanted to contact you and they feel just as moved as I did back in 1995, that I had this awesome trailblazer of a science teacher, Miss Diana Monaco, that like set us straight, told me the truth, was a straight shooter. How could they contact you and what are you doing now?
I am taking care of my elderly mom mostly, but I'm also volunteering. I volunteer with the immigrant community locally through my own parish here. I teach online, one-on-one, I tutor, and I pick and I choose. Really do pick and choose what I do want to do now. And I do stuff like this, which is
Thank you.
a lot of fun because this is, what the experience and the effort that I've put in. This is the gift that I get. I get to do stuff like this, and I get to talk to younger people, and I get to be a guide in some way. This is the gift that I get.
Well, we here at Functional Training Zone and the Uncommon Connector just want to thank you so much for
Thank you.
taking this time out to talk to us all the way from Brooklyn, New York. I'm super excited to have talked to you after all of these years. And this is great. Thank you. So we talked about being a pharmacist, your path to school, being a teacher, and really just how that has shaped all of the minds that you've touched for all of these years. And I personally want to thank you for being part of my life um, up until now.
Well,
Thank
thank you, Al.
you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Most valuable commodity I know of is information. Wouldn't you agree?
I don't even know what that means.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
No, it's not.
It gets the people going.
It's
Now!
It's your boy JR dropping them beats.